Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is the Metro DC Democratic Socialists of America Socialist Night School. This is a regular series of introductory events that don't require any sort of experience or expertise in the topic. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the US's use of the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Earlier this month in August marked the 75th anniversary of both of those horrific acts. And I don't know if you followed any of the discussion in the more mainstream media about the anniversary. It was unsurprisingly the same sorts of myths and lies we usually hear about these events, that the US had to do it, it was a military necessity, etc. But we're going to hear a very different perspective tonight on the US's use of the atomic bombs. We're going to hear from Peter Kuznick, who is a professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He is the co-author of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives, and The Decision to Risk the Future, Harry Truman, the Atomic Bomb, and the Apocalyptic Narrative. He also co-authored with Oliver Stone, the New York Times best-selling The Untold History of the United States, which was also made into a documentary television series for Showtime and is now on Netflix. I watched it when it first came out on Showtime, and I was very surprised that Peter and Oliver Stone got to put something like that on US TV, surprised in a good way. And I went back and watched some of the earlier episodes on Netflix recently, and they held up quite well. So we're very honored to have you tonight, Peter, and take it away from here.
Thank you, Chip. We look at the world now. One of the things that struck me about the Democratic Party convention last week was that it's as if nuclear has become the new N-word. There was almost no discussion of nuclear issues at the Democratic convention, even though you would think that of all the things they could go after Donald Trump for, his nuclear policies have been right at the top of that list. It's under Trump's presidency that the bullet and the atomic scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to first 2 minutes before midnight in January 2018, after we almost went to war with North Korea, and then more recently to 100 seconds before midnight. The bulletin started the doomsday clock back in 1947. That's the closest we've been toward nuclear annihilation, is the point we're at now. US relations with Russia and China are at a nadir. I did 2 interviews today, one with Russian TV about the Tsar Bomba, the Soviet nuclear test in 1961 of a 50 megaton nuclear bomb, which is a bomb 3,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. I did another interview with Spanish newspaper El Periódico about the crisis in the South China Sea and how close we are to a military confrontation with China right now, as relations between the US and China are the worst since the conflicts at Quemoy and Matsu in the late 1950s. So it's a very, very dangerous world. We now have 14,000 nuclear weapons in the world. The US and Russia control 93% of those nuclear weapons. Under Trump, we've dismantled the nuclear treaties, beginning with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, followed by the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, followed by the Open Skies Treaty. The only nuclear arms control treaty left is the New START Treaty. That expires in February 2021. Trump has indicated he doesn't like the treaty and he doesn't want to renew it. Putin has implored him to renew that treaty, and Trump so far has refused to do so. If that goes, then we're back at an old-fashioned nuclear arms race. What's Trump's opinion about that? He says he doesn't mind that. He welcomes a nuclear arms race. He says we can win it. We've got the most military and economic and technological capability. We can win it. When Trump found out that the US had, how much we had cut our nuclear arsenal from the peak in late 1960s and again in 1985, when we had close to 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, down now to 14,000, Trump said we should increase our nuclear arsenal tenfold. It was at that point that Secretary of State Tillerson called him an absolute fucking moron, and he deserved it. But with this kind of dangerous situation, this kind of leadership in both parties to some extent, but especially in the Republican Party, the world is in a very, very precarious position right now. And what I want to talk about today is how we got into this, how the mythology surrounding this still legitimizes the possession of nuclear weapons and potentially the use of nuclear weapons. Because what is the big myth? Now, I guess I should say that my students sometimes sit through 12 hours on this topic. I'm not going to try to give a 12-hour lecture tonight, and I don't have visuals to accompany it. So I'm going to do an abbreviated version, but I want to give you the essentials so you are armed in order to combat the myths. And what are the myths? The fundamental myth is that the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to prevent an invasion. The Japanese were fanatics. The only way to get Japan to surrender without use of atomic bombs was for the US to invade. Truman writes in his memoir that General Marshall told me, he said, that a US invasion would cost 500,000 American lives. He later raises that figure to 1 million. Others like George H.W. Bush praised Truman for his tough calculating decision that saved millions of American lives. So that's the myth. Not only we saved millions of American lives, we saved millions of Japanese lives. Therefore, the use of the bomb was not only justifiable, it was actually humane. It was benevolent. It saved lives. And where do we see this cropping up? Well, a few examples. The best-selling book, Countdown 1945 by Fox News stalwart Chris Wallace, in which he writes, despite all his misgivings, Truman knew he had to drop the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project had given him a weapon to potentially end the war. And no matter how devastating their losses, the Japanese refused to surrender. They left him no choice. Okay, we can write him off as a Fox News host. How about Susan Rice, the former UN ambassador and national security advisor, educated woman, went to Stanford. She wrote a New York Times op-ed in 2019, which she said, following D-Day, my father was sent to the West Coast to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. He was spared combat by President Harry Truman's decision to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, provoking the Japanese surrender. She should know better. My colleague Bart Bernstein teaches at Stanford. I asked Bart recently if he ever had Susan Rice as a student. He said he doesn't remember. Bart was there for a long time. But maybe her vision was clouded by the fact that she was a Truman scholar when she was at Stanford. Not just that, Barack Obama. When Barack Obama visited Hiroshima in May of 2016, now I applauded him going to Hiroshima. From the start of his presidency, I urged him to go there. Only one American president had visited Hiroshima, and that was Jimmy Carter, but he went there when he was no longer in office. So Obama announced he was going to go there in May of 2016. And he gave a speech in front of the cenotaph. And what does he do there? Well, first of all, the whole thing was obscene in a lot of ways. He spent more than twice as much time with the soldiers and sailors and Japanese troops at the Iwakuni military base than he did in Hiroshima. He spent, I think, 8 minutes in the A-bomb museum. Then he went to the cenotaph and he gave his talk. And from the first line, it was a lie. The opening sentence was, death fell from the skies at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, death didn't fall from the skies. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. I chastised my students for use of passive voice. Well, Barack Obama should certainly know better and did know better. But then he doubled down and he said, World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's the myth. That's the lie. That's what we have to combat. So what is the reality on this? There are basically three narratives surrounding the use of the atomic bombs. The first is the heroic or triumphal narrative. And that says that the United States, being the good guys in the good war, dropped atomic bombs justifiably in order to avoid an invasion. And so that's the heroic narrative. The second narrative is the tragic narrative. And the tragic narrative argues that the atomic bombings were a tragedy. They killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese women and children and a small handful of military people, of soldiers, that it was tragedy because we could have gotten the Japanese to surrender some other way without the use of the atomic bombs. I introduced a third narrative into this debate, and mine is called the apocalyptic narrative. And I accept a lot of the tragic narrative. It certainly was a tragedy, but I argue that to condemn Truman even more fulsomely, because what I argue is that Truman used atomic bombs knowing there was no military necessity or moral justification, and also knowing that he was beginning a process that could end all life on the planet, and still went ahead and did it in the most cavalier way that he had been explicitly warned could possibly trigger the kind of nuclear arms race that would bring down the final curtain on mankind. So let me tell you a little bit about this. Now, Harry Truman. I want to begin with this passage from Shakespeare's Hamlet that Truman underlined in his copy of the play. And Shakespeare writes, "Let me speak of the yet unknowing world, how these things came about. So shall you hear of the carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot, purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads. All this I can truly deliver." And I'm going to deliver that today. So the story really begins back in December of 1938, when two German physicists, Hahn and Strassmann, bombard uranium with neutrons and produce barium. Lisa Meitner interpreted this to be the first case of nuclear fission. Word of that came to the United States in January of 1939. By Niels Bohr, the beloved Danish physicist, brought word of this to a conference here in Washington, D.C. And immediately, smart physicists and even smart graduate students understood that this meant the theoretical possibility of developing atomic bombs. Most Americans, including the military, were not terribly moved by that fact. The ones who were most alarmed were the European emigre scientists who had escaped from Nazi-occupied Europe. They understood that this meant that Germany, given its technological and scientific prowess, could develop nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage. Now Germany actually did begin the nuclear project at that point. Paul Hartek, who was a Rutherford student at Cambridge, wrote to Hitler's War Office in late April 1939 and said, "We take the liberty of calling your attention to the newest development in nuclear physics, which in our opinion will probably make it possible to produce an explosive many orders of magnitude more powerful than conventional ones. That country which makes first use of it has an unsurpassable advantage over the others." So Germany began meetings on the ministerial level. They banned the export of uranium. They authorized a nuclear research program and put it in the hands of Werner Heisenberg, a very capable physicist who had developed the uncertainty principle back in the 1920s. The emigre scientists tried to alert American military authorities. They didn't want to listen. So Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, two of the 7 brilliant Hungarian Jewish physicist who had escaped to the United States, went to see America's most famous scientist in the summer of 1939. That was Albert Einstein. Einstein was vacationing at that point in Peconic, Long Island. So they got a car, they drove out on July 16th, 1939, and told Einstein that the Germans had split the uranium atom. Einstein had been out of the loop, working on his unified field theory. He immediately understood it. They drafted a letter to President Roosevelt that was delivered by the New Deal economist Alexander Sachs, in which Einstein warned about the German bomb and encouraged the United States to begin its own nuclear research program. Roosevelt responded to Sachs. He said, "Alex, what you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." And he authorized the beginning of the nuclear research program. Einstein later told Linus Pauling, he said, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. But there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make them." Einstein actually wrote 3 letters to Roosevelt urging him to do that. So the United States begins the nuclear research on some level in 1939. They put it in the hands of 65-year-old soil physicist Lyman Briggs, who directed what was called the Uranium Committee. Briggs conducted meetings of the Uranium Committee the same way Ronald Reagan used to conduct cabinet meetings. He'd welcome everybody, eat a few jelly beans, and fall asleep. So the project did not move at all. As Wigner later said, "We often felt we were swimming in syrup." Initially, then, this took about 3 years before it got moving. But it got moving with some spurring by the British. British set up something that was called the Maud Committee. And they issued a report that didn't get to the United States until June of 1941. The Americans were assuming it would require 500 tons of pure uranium to make a bomb. The Maud Committee report showed that all that was needed was between 11 and 22 pounds of pure uranium, which made it feasible at that point. And so in late 1941, the United States, Roosevelt authorizes a serious bomb project, which begins in 1942 with the establishment of METLab at the University of Chicago, the Metallurgical Laboratory, in the summer of 1942. So World War II we think of as the physicists' war. World War I is sometimes labeled the chemists' war because of the use of chemical warfare and poison gas. Now, I know a lot about that because almost all the poison gas research took place at American University, where I teach. Most of America's leading chemists came to American University. They took over 60 buildings and they began the chemical warfare research, which we don't have time to discuss today. But these physicists at METLab in Chicago in 42 set up a special committee chaired by Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer took some of the leading physicists out to Berkeley for the summer of 1942. They were called the luminaries. It included not only Oppenheimer, but Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, Robert Serber, Robert Tolman, Felix Bloch, Jean Van Vleck, Emil Konopsky, and they began to do all these studies about the bomb and the making it and the consequences. And one day they stopped in fear. They realized that based on the calculations they were coming up with, that igniting an atomic bomb could ignite all the hydrogen in the atmosphere or all the nitrogen all the hydrogen in the oceans or all the nitrogen in the atmosphere and set the entire planet on fire. Oppenheimer called up Compton, who was vacationing in Michigan, and he rushed out to Michigan to see him and explained this risk of igniting the entire planet. And Compton told him, stop the research. Compton said, better to accept the slavery of the Nazis than to run a chance of drawing the final curtain on mankind. They halted the research, went back there, did more calculations, and Bethe realized they'd overlooked something. And then they decided that the chances of blowing up the world were actually only 3 in a million. And they decided those odds were good enough, and they proceeded with the project. So the project takes off. Now, on the way out to Berkeley, Edward Teller shared a booth on the train with Hans Bethe. And during that discussion, he said, this problem of the atomic bomb is really scientifically trivial. Let's skip this and let's go immediately to developing the super bomb, the hydrogen bomb, thermonuclear bomb, the process that occurs inside the sun. From the beginning, this is what Teller had in mind. He knew this was theoretically possible. And what we know is that the atomic bomb is actually just the trigger for the hydrogen bomb, and that the hydrogen bombs could be made any size they wanted. There's no limit to that, which is the bar Tsomba, the Tsar Bomba that I talked about with Russian television today. So the Germans do begin their bomb project, but they quickly lost interest in it. Albert Speer was told by the scientists that the bomb would probably not be ready for 2 to 4 years. And so he and Hitler decided, let's not waste our resources on something we're not going to have. Let's instead put my effort into V1 and V2 rockets. So Germany really abandoned this bomb project in 1942. The United States doesn't figure this out until late 1944. At that point, when the Americans figured out that Germany does not have a bomb project, only one physicist left the Manhattan Project, and that was Joseph Rotblatt. Rotblatt was an extraordinary individual. He goes on later to win the Nobel Peace Prize and becomes an anti-nuclear campaigner for the rest of his life. But the American scientists believed that the Germans were ahead of us. They thought we were maybe 1 to 2 years behind the Germans up until late 1944. So then to put this, to understand what is happening, we have to put this in political context. And there are 2 important developments that we need to understand. The first is what's happening inside the Democratic Party. I asked my students, who was America's vice president between 1941 and 1945? And very few of them even know the answer to that. Henry Wallace, the most extraordinary man to be close to that level of power, has been pretty much wiped out of the history books. But Wallace was a dominant figure at the time. He had been Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture during the New Deal. In 1940, Roosevelt knew we were on the verge of a war against fascism, and he wanted an outspoken anti-fascist on the ticket, and so he chose Henry Wallace. Wallace comes from this distinguished farm family in Iowa. His grandfather published Wallace's Farmer, the leading farm journal. His father was Secretary of Agriculture in the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And then Wallace restores American agriculture during the New Deal. In 1940, the party bosses told Roosevelt they didn't want to put Wallace on the ticket. He was too radical. He had been a Republican, and they didn't trust him. And so Roosevelt knew he was getting the nomination for a 3rd term, and he wrote a letter to the Democratic Party convention in which he turned down the nomination. He said, we already have one Wall Street dominated, money dominated conservative party, the Republicans. If the Democrats aren't going to be a party that stands for liberal ideas and social justice and progressive ideas, said that the Democrats have no reason to exist, and I'm not going to run on that ticket. Eleanor Roosevelt went to the floor of the convention for the first time a first lady did that, and convinced them that he was serious, so they begrudgingly put Wallace on the ticket. But the party bosses were going to get their revenge. As vice president, Wallace was an exemplary figure. When Henry Luce, the head of the Time Life empire, said that the 20th century must be the American century, that the United States is going to dominate the world financially, culturally, politically, militarily, economically, Wallace made his famous speech. He said the 20th century must instead become the century of the common man. He called for a worldwide people's revolution in the tradition of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions, the German Revolution of 1848, and the Russian Revolution. He called for the US and the Soviets to work together after the war to build world peace. He called for an end to imperialism, an end to colonialism, an end to monopolies and cartels, a global New Deal, worldwide full employment. Wallace had the most progressive vision of anybody as president or vice president we've ever had. But the party bosses were out to get him. And so they staged what the treasurer of the Democratic Party, Edwin Pauley, called Pauley's coup. Pauley was a California oil millionaire who said, I went into politics when I realized it was cheaper to elect a new Congress than to buy up the old one. He later gets indicted. And he and Hannigan devised this plot that we'll talk about in a second. The problem was that Wallace was so popular. Wallace was the second most popular man in the United States behind Franklin Roosevelt. So when the Democratic Party started on July 20th, 1944, in steamy Chicago at the Chicago Stadium, Gallup released a poll of potential Democratic voters asking them who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% said they wanted Henry Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. Who was Harry Truman? He was a nobody. Harry Truman, well, we won't draw any parallels to Joe Biden, but Harry Truman was not exactly a scintillating, inspirational figure at the time. Truman had a rough upbringing. His father was a man named John Peanuts Truman. He was called Peanuts because he was about 5 feet 3 inches tall, but he was a tough guy. And he grew up on the farm in Missouri, and he wanted a tough guy for his son. And his father, John Truman, would go around beating up men a foot taller to show how tough he was. He wanted a macho son. Unfortunately, Harry was not a macho son. The macho one was Harry's younger brother, Vivian. Harry was diagnosed from the beginning as having hypermetropia, or flat eyeballs, which means he had to wear Coke bottle thick glasses. He couldn't roughhouse. He couldn't play sports. He couldn't fight with the other kids. And the kids were very cruel. They would call him Harry True Woman, Harry Four Eyes, Sissy. They would chase him home from school every day. He'd be greeted by his mother, who said, Harry, don't worry, you were meant to be a girl anyway. And we know this from Truman's own writings about this. He had a very difficult childhood. Not only did his father not respect him, when he was 10 years old, he got diphtheria, spent 6 months being pushed around in a baby carriage. And he says later, I guess I really was a sissy. So he has a lot of psychological issues as a result of that. Harry was a smart student, liked to study history, but unfortunately, his family didn't have enough money to send him to college. So Harry didn't go to college and instead went into business. He went into 3 businesses. They all went belly up. They all went broke, including his haberdashery. He had no success in life until he enlisted in the military in World War I, served admirably, and comes back and got then picked up by the Pendergast machine, the corrupt political machine that ran Kansas City. In this day, the political machine still ran the big cities. And Truman was probably the most honest member of this political machine. But he was going nowhere in life. He was building roads and courthouses. So when he was 49, he says to his daughter, tomorrow I'll be 49. For all the good I've done in the world, they may as well take away the 9 and take away the 40. I may as well just be 9 years old. The next year, when he turned 50, he was meeting in Sedalia, Missouri, with boss Pendergast and Aylesworth, his right-hand man, his lieutenant. And Truman was about to tell him he was leaving the machine to go back to the farm. But Pendergast stops him and says, you can't do that. He says, we need you to run for the Senate. Truman says, run for the Senate? I was hoping you would run me for Congress. I said, but why the Senate? I don't know anything about the world. I know how to build roads. And Pendergast says, don't worry. We'll get you elected and we'll give you advisors who will tell you what to do. And that's what happened. So Truman gets elected. But Truman didn't know that 4 other people had already turned down Pendergast's offer before Pendergast offered it to Truman. So Truman gets elected. The other senators shun him. They label him the senator from Pendergast. They consider him a corrupt hack. And even Roosevelt, even though Truman was basically a loyal New Deal Democrat from Missouri, Roosevelt didn't support him. So Truman was up for re-election in 1940, and Roosevelt refused to support him, to endorse him. Truman was coming in third. Pendergast was now in federal prison in Kansas City, so he couldn't help him. So Truman, when he was coming in third, about to lose, turned to the Hannigan-Dickman machine that ran St. Louis, another corrupt political machine. And they threw their support to him, and he eked out a very narrow victory. His second term was a little bit better, gaining a little bit more respect and stature. He ran an investigation into the defense spending that didn't really embarrass anybody, but at least he began to get a reputation. So when the party bosses were looking for someone to replace Wallace, what they said was that Roosevelt is sick. He's never going to survive another 4 years. This was 1944. He's never going to survive another 4 years. Whoever becomes vice president will become the next president, and Henry Wallace is just too radical to risk that. So they ran this coup, and it looked like they had the party bosses behind it. But at the convention, Wallace made the seconding speech for Roosevelt. At that point, there was a spontaneous demonstration. The place went wild. This went on for more than an hour. You had Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson and others leading this demonstration. In the middle of it, Senator Claude Pepper, or Claude Red Pepper as he was known, from Florida, realized that if he could get to the front of the room, get Wallace's name and nomination that night, Wallace would sweep the convention, defy the bosses, be back on the ticket as vice president. So Pepper started to fight his way to the microphone. The party bosses, led by Chicago Mayor Kelly, saw what was happening. They start rushing to the front, screaming to Sam Jackson, who's chairing it, "This is a fire hazard, adjourn immediately." Jackson said, "I have a motion to adjourn. All in favor say aye." Maybe 5% said aye. All opposed, no. 95% boomed out no. Jackson said, "Motion carried, meeting adjourned." Pepper was at that point 5 feet from the microphone. Had Pepper gotten 5 more feet to the microphone and Wallace become president, vice president again, and then president on April 12th, 1945, when Roosevelt died, there would have, in my opinion, been no atomic bombings in 1945. I'm certain of that. And there would have almost certainly been no Cold War. All of history would have been different. And sometimes the margin is that narrow in terms of historical vicissitudes. Unfortunately, by the third ballot, all the deals kicked in, the money changed hands, the postmaster generalships changed hands, all the ambassadorships, and then Truman got the nomination. Wallace stayed on as Secretary of Commerce. Roosevelt begged him to, and told Wallace he could have any position that he wants other than Secretary of State, because he didn't want to break Cordell Hull's heart. And so Wallace took Secretary of Commerce. And from that position in the cabinet, he fights against the nuclear arms race, and he fights against the Cold War. Anyway, so that's the beginning of the political background. The other thing is what happens on April 12th, 1945, a day that really shall live in infamy, and that's the day that Roosevelt died. Truman went over to the Capitol, Sam Rayburn's office. They had a new supply of whiskey. They were there to play poker that night. When he gets there, he says, "You have a message from Steve Early at the White House." He said, "Call immediately before you even have a drink." Early tells Truman, "Rush over here, don't talk to anybody, get here as fast as you can." He's greeted at the door, he's ushered upstairs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a big woman, hovers over Truman, who was not a big man, and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." This room starts to spin. Truman had this recurring nightmare that the Secret Service knocked on his door in the middle of the night and told him that he was president now, that Roosevelt was dead, and now it had happened. His room starts spinning. He almost passes out. He finally comes to his senses and said, "I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Eleanor Roosevelt says, "You're the one in trouble now. Is there anything we can do for you?" Well, it wasn't just Truman who was in trouble. It was the world that was in trouble. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. During that time, Roosevelt had spoken to him twice about nothing of substance. He knew nothing about what happened at Tehran, Casablanca, Yalta, the deals, the tensions between the US and the British, the alliances between the US and the Soviets. Truman knew nothing. In fact, this is astounding, but people had so little regard for Truman that even though he was vice president for 82 days, nobody even bothered to tell him that the United States was building an atomic bomb. After he gets sworn in on April 12th, Secretary of War Stimson says to him, "We're building the most destructive weapon in history." Truman said, "Well, I found that curious, but I didn't ask him anything about it because my mind was on other things." The next day, Truman's first in office, James Burns, flies up from Spartanburg, South Carolina, in Navy Secretary Forrestal's private plane. And he briefs Truman. And he says several things. He says that the Russians are breaking all their agreements and can't be trusted. He also says that he also gives Truman the first serious briefing about the atomic bomb. Truman writes in his memoir, he said it was a weapon great enough to destroy the whole world. Not a bigger, more powerful bomb, a weapon great enough to destroy the whole world. Truman also, so that was his first full briefing on the atomic bomb. I'm looking for something here that I wanted to mention if I could find it, which I can't find it. Truman gets a fuller briefing on April 25th. Well, first of all, let me backtrack 1 second. So Truman on that afternoon goes to the Congress to meet with the congressman this is April 13th. And the reporters see him outside there and they come up to him and they wish him well. And Truman says, "Boys, I don't know if you ever had a load of hay fall on you, but the way I feel as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets have fallen on me." He said, "Boys, if you pray for me now." One of the reporters said, "Good luck, Mr. President." And Truman said, "I wish you didn't have to call me that." The first 2 weeks, everybody Truman met with, he said, "This is a mistake. I shouldn't be president. I'm not big enough. I'm not smart enough. Somebody else should take over and do the job who can do it." But then Truman decides after 2 weeks, they tell him he better make believe he's capable of being president, or else the country's going to lose faith and we're in even deeper trouble than we thought. So Truman is going to now try to play the role of president of the United States. Truman gets a deeper briefing on April 25th from Secretary of War Stimson and General Groves. General Leslie Groves was in charge of the Manhattan Project. And so they give Truman a fuller briefing in which they say that, and a written report that says that within 4 months, we're going to have a weapon so powerful that one of these bombs will be able to take out an entire city. That what we do with this bomb and steps we take to control it is going to determine the future of human civilization. Truman writes in his memoir, Truman writes in his diary, let me find this. He says, "Simpson said gravely that he didn't know whether we could or should use the bomb because he was afraid that it was so powerful it could end up destroying the whole world. I felt the same fear as he and Groves continue to talk about it, and when I read Groves' 24-page report." So again, not a bigger, more powerful weapon, a weapon great enough to destroy the entire world. Truman again says this when he was at Potsdam. The United States tests the atomic bomb on July 16th, 1945 in Alamogordo, New Mexico. The bomb test was more than 18 kilotons, or more than 18,000 tons of TNT, really 18,500 tons of TNT. It blew people away. Some of them said they thought that they ignited the entire sky on fire, that the world was over. General Farrell said the roar smacked of doomsday. They were all horrified by how powerful this bomb was. Truman gets a full report, and Truman writes in his diary at Potsdam on July 25th, he said, "We've discovered the most terrible bomb in history. This may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark." Again, not a more powerful bomb, the fire destruction, the end of the planet, the end of life. So Truman knew what he was getting into, and he knew what he was doing. Roosevelt had been very ambiguous. He'd said that maybe we'll use the bomb after a test, after a demonstration, after warnings. Roosevelt had never officially decided he was going to use the bomb, but Truman apparently believed that that's what the policy was. So then why does the US drop the bomb? The official interpretation is to avoid the invasion. And that the American strategy for ending the war was aerial bombardment, blockade, and then an invasion. Would the US have had to invade? Now, first of all, there's a big debate over the projected casualty figures. Some of the defenders of the bomb argue that 1 million men would have been lost in an invasion. That's greatly exaggerated. The highest official total we've been able to find was 46,000. But it's not even relevant because the United States was not about to invade. Once we tested the bomb successfully, then it was a choice between negotiations or use of the bomb. And invasion was off the table. As Admiral Leahy, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was Truman's personal chief of staff, Admiral Leahy said, "I could never see from a national defense point of view any reason for an invasion of an already thoroughly defeated Japan." So that was the attitude of the military leaders. They were not going to invade Japan. That's nonsense. That's just the mythology. But was an invasion necessary? And the answer to that is also no. That the Japanese had begun doing studies in 1943 for how to end the war. The Japanese realized after the Battle of Saipan in July of 1944 that victory was impossible. But Kuiso, Prime Minister Kuiso, who headed up the government, adopted a very unfortunate policy of waiting for one more military victory before they sued for peace. And the Japanese never got another military victory. The Japanese Navy was decimated. For example, the Navy had lost 7 of 12 battleships by the end of 1944, 19 of 25 aircraft carriers, 103 out of 160 submarines, 31 out of 47 cruisers, and 118 out of 158 destroyers. The Japanese Navy was decimated. The Japanese Air Force was decimated. The Japanese military was tied down. Prince Konoe, the 3-time former prime minister, wrote to the emperor in February of 1945, and he said, "I regret to inform you, but defeat is inevitable." Those were his words. He said, what we have to do is avoid a communist revolution once we surrender. That was the fear of the capitalists and the militarists who ran the Japanese government. The fear, and they studied what happened in Eastern Europe, where there were spontaneous uprisings when the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe. And that's what they talked about in the cabinet meetings, the danger of a communist revolution. The Americans knew that the Japanese were defeated. They knew that they were searching for a way out. Now, how did we know? What was the main stumbling block for the Japanese? The idea is that the Japanese were mindless fanatics who were going to fight to the death. But in the spring and summer of 1945, Secretary of War Stimson and General Marshall, Chief of Staff, both commissioned intelligence reports that said that the Japanese were not fanatics, that they would not fight to the death. When they knew they were defeated, they would surrender. So if they knew that, then why didn't they surrender when it was clear in 1945 that they were defeated? And the issue there is the US demand for unconditional surrender. What unconditional surrender meant to the Japanese was that the emperor would be tried as a war criminal and probably executed. As General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command said in a background report in the summer of 45, the execution of the emperor to them would be comparable to the crucifixion of Christ to us. All would fight to die like ants. Almost every one of Truman's close advisors, especially those who knew something about Japan, urged him to change the surrender terms. Led by Joseph Grew, who was the acting Secretary of State in 1945, and who was the former US ambassador to Japan. Grew, Duman, Ballantyne, the ones who knew the most about Japan, all said it might be impossible to get Japan to surrender under any circumstances if we demand them to surrender unconditionally. We knew that. And how do we know that? We knew that that was the main stumbling block because we had broken their codes early in the war and were intercepting their telegrams. I could go through a lot on this, but I don't think it would take us a long time to do so. Let me just give you a little bit of this. The Japanese had decided in May of 1945, the Supreme War Council decided that they needed to try to get the Soviets, who had still been neutral, to intervene on their behalf to get better surrender terms from the US and the British. So they've offered various concessions to the Soviets to intervene on their behalf to get them better surrender terms. The Supreme War Council issued a statement after their meetings in May of 1945, and they said, at the present moment, when Japan is waging a life or death struggle against the US and Britain, Soviet entry into the war will deal a death blow to the Japanese empire. So we have to do whatever we can to keep the Soviets out of the war. So they decide to approach the Soviet Union. In June 2nd and June 3rd, the former Japanese Prime Minister Hirota met with Soviet Ambassador Malik in Tokyo. Malik wrote back to the Kremlin, said that the Japanese are desperate to surrender. The Soviets knew this better than anybody, how desperate the Japanese were to surrender. The Americans knew this too. And at Potsdam, which begins, July 16th, July 17th, Truman went there to meet with Stalin and Churchill for the first time. And there they were going to put the Potsdam Proclamation into effect. Stimson brought a copy of the proposed Potsdam Proclamation, which gave explicit warnings to the Japanese that they could keep the emperor. But Burns was Truman's most trusted advisor. Truman made Burns Secretary of State on July 3rd, 1945, but he'd been trusting him as an advisor before that. And Burns told Truman that if you tell them, or if you let the Japanese keep the emperor, you're going to be politically crucified, because there was so much hatred toward the emperor in the United States. Almost every other advisor urged him to change the surrender terms so that the Japanese would surrender. But Truman refused to do so. And at Potsdam, they rejected Stimson's language, and they instead issued a Potsdam Proclamation that gave the Japanese no assurances on the emperor. But the top secret report, but there were two reports or several reports in which American intelligence, the Joint Intelligence Committees, the Joint Chiefs of Staff made very explicit that the Japanese were ready to surrender, were militarily defeated. And they said that Now, I got a lot of these different reports here. The estimate of the enemy situation, the top secret report for the Potsdam meeting says, we believe that a considerable portion of the Japanese population now consider absolute military defeat to be probable. The increasing effects of sea blockade and devastation wrought by strategic bombing, which has rendered millions of homeless and destroyed 25 to 50% of the built-up area of Japan's most important cities, should make this realization increasingly general. The Pacific Strategic Intelligence Summary for the week of the Potsdam meeting says, it may be said that Japan now officially, if not publicly, recognizes her defeat, abandoning as unobtainable the long-cherished goal of victory. It goes on and on. Now, we knew this because we had broken the codes. We were intercepting the telegrams. And the telegrams from Foreign Minister Togo in Tokyo to Ambassador to the ambassador in Moscow said over and over again, I should read you some of them. The July 12th telegram says unconditional surrender is the only obstacle to peace. The telegrams going back and forth said repeatedly that it is His Majesty's heart desire to end the war and stop the bloodshed as long as the Americans will recognize the honor of Japan and the existence of the royal family. So the Americans knew that. In fact, Truman knew that. Truman himself refers to the intercepted July 12th telegram as the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. Everybody around Truman said the same thing, that they all knew that the Japanese were trying to surrender. Walter Brown was the assistant to James Burns. Aboard the USS Augusta on the way back from Potsdam on August 3rd, Brown writes in his diary, he says, aboard the Augusta, President Truman, Admiral Leahy, and Burns agree the Japs are looking for peace. We know this from a lot of different sources. Alan Dulles, the future head of the CIA, was with the Secret Service, and he writes in his book, The Secret Surrender, he says, on July 20th, under instructions from Washington, I went to the Potsdam conference, reported there to Secretary Simpson what I had learned from Tokyo, that they desired to surrender if they could retain the emperor and the Constitution as the basis for maintaining discipline after the devastating news of surrender. So, I mean, we all knew that. All of Truman's advisors said that explicitly, that the Japanese were trying to surrender, and that if the US changed the surrender terms, we could end the war. The Stimson was the most dogged in this regard. And Stimson confronted Truman and Burns at Potsdam. And Truman said, if you don't like what we're doing, why don't you pack your bags and go home? Stimson was a 78-year-old, very frail Secretary of State, a Secretary of War at the time. And he was imploring them to change the surrender terms, but they refused to do so. So when the Potsdam Proclamation was issued, it did not. But there was one other way to get the Japanese to surrender without an invasion, without use of the bomb, and that was to wait for the Soviet invasion. The day after Pearl Harbor, the US Secretary of State Cordell Hull and President Roosevelt had urged the Soviets to come into the Pacific War. But Stalin was busy fighting his war against Germany. As some of you hopefully know, throughout most of the European war, the US and the British were facing 10 German divisions between us. The Soviets were facing 200 German divisions on their own. If we had more time, I'd go into this history, because I give a lot of lectures on who actually won the war in Europe. The Americans believe we did. The Europeans believe that the Allies won the war in Europe. It's the biggest crock of shit in the world. As Churchill said, the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine. The Germans lost 1 million on the Western Front, 6 million on the Eastern Front. The Americans lost 310,000 in combat, 400,000 overall. The Soviets lost 27 million in World War II. There's a lot to go into, but we don't have the time to do that. But the Soviets promised, then at Yalta, Stalin promises Roosevelt, Yalta was in February of 45, Stalin promised that Soviets will come into the Pacific War within 3 months, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. The war in Europe ends May 7th or 8th, which means that the Soviets are supposed to come into the war May 8th or 9th. What did that mean? On April 11th, the Joint Intelligence Staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff reported, quote, if at any time the USSR should enter the war, all Japanese will realize that absolute defeat is inevitable. The Supreme War Council has said that Soviet entry into the war will deal a death blow to the empire. The top secret report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting at Potsdam from American intelligence says an entry of the Soviet Union into the war would finally convince the Japanese of the inevitability of complete defeat. What did Truman understand? Truman said he went to Potsdam to make sure that the Soviets were coming in. He had lunch with Stalin on July 17th. Afterwards, he goes back and he writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife, Bess, the Soviets are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. Truman wasn't ambiguous about this. He knew that the Soviet invasion was going to end the war. They all knew the Soviet invasion was going to end the war. Yet the United States goes ahead and uses 2 atomic bombs. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Paul Tibbets, drops a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima, a city of 300,000 civilians, 43 Japanese troops, and 45,000 Korean slave laborers. The death toll is approximately 140,000 by the end of 1945, 200,000 by 1950. It hit with a blast equivalent to 16 kilotons. On midnight on August 8th, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria. It immediately blows away the Kwantung Army. The mighty Kwantung Army, 700,000 troops, was decimated by the Soviet invasion. Immediately that morning, all the Japanese officials gather around Foreign Minister Togo and say, this changes everything. We've got to surrender as quickly as possible. Then on 11:02 a.m., the United States drops the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. About 75,000, actually 74,000 dead by the end of 1945, 140,000 dead by 1950. While the cabinet was deliberating, they got word that the Nagasaki had been bombed. There was almost no discussion of it at all. In fact, Army Minister Anami came into the cabinet meeting and said, I have intelligence that the United States has 100 more atomic bombs and Tokyo is the next target. That changed nobody's mind. How do we make sense out of this? We make sense out of this because the United States had been firebombing Japanese cities for months. In the European war, the Americans had avoided firebombing European cities. The United States had carried out, until late in the war, precision bombing against military and industrial targets. That's a very different approach that the United States adopted in Japan. Lieutenant General Haywood Hansel had been in charge of the US Air Force there. He refused to switch the bombing orders to target Japanese civilians and cities. So he was sacked and replaced by General Curtis LeMay. And LeMay changed the bombing strategy to firebomb Japanese cities. It begins on the night of March 9th and 10th with a huge raid of the city of Tokyo, in which between 80,000 and 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed. It set the canals on fire. People were turned into human torches in the streets. People in the planes Americans in the planes were vomiting from the stench of burned flesh. It took months before they could even clean the ruins down there. It was truly horrific. LeMay considered it his masterpiece. But the Americans went on from there to bomb more than 100 Japanese cities. 3/4 of the American bomb loads were incendiaries intended to create firestorms and burn down Japan's paper and bamboo cities, as we call them. This destruction reached 99.5% of the city of Toyama. Oliver Stone and I went to Toyama a couple of years ago. We were invited by the government there to commemorate. They were going to open up a new museum there for the firebombing. And because Oliver and I had written about this and put in our documentaries, they wanted us to come and do a series of lectures and meet with the survivors, which we did. So Toyama was the worst, but other cities were almost as badly firebombed. But to the Japanese leaders, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was 2 more cities. They were willing to accept that Japanese cities could be wiped out by the Americans. What changed the equation for the Japanese was the Soviet invasion. That's what they dreaded. That changed the entire geostrategic situation. And that's what forced the Japanese surrender. If we had more time, I could go into a lot more detail on this, which my students are here. But Prime Minister Suzuki sums it up. On August 13th, the day before the official surrender went through, he was asked by a doctor why they had to rush so quickly to surrender. And the prime minister says, we can't delay. He says, I can't do that. If we miss today, the Soviet Union will take not only Manchuria, Korea, Karafuto, but also Hokkaido. This would destroy the foundation of Japan. We must end the war when we can deal with the United States. We also have the interrogation of Japanese military leaders by the US Army interrogators, and General Kawabe, the Deputy Chief of Staff, Admiral Toyota, and other top leaders, when they were asked what forced the Japanese surrender, they said the atomic bomb had little impact. In fact, it was the Soviet invasion that convinced us we had to surrender as quickly as possible. And but we know this from other sources. A top secret report in January of 1946 by the intelligence staff of the War Department Operations Division says, and I'll just read a bit, it says the emperor decided as early as 20 June 1945 to terminate the war. From 11 July, attempts to negotiate a peace were carried on through messages to Sato, the Japanese ambassador to Russia. On 12 July, Prince Konoe was named as envoy to ask the Soviet Union to use its good offices to end the war. While the Japanese were waiting an answer from Russia, there occurred the disastrous event which the Japanese leaders regarded as an utter catastrophe, which they had energetically sought to prevent at any cost. Russia declared war upon Japan and began moving her forces into Manchuria. Investigation shows there was little mention in the Japanese cabinet of the use of the atomic bomb by the US in the discussions leading up to the 9th August decision. The dropping of the bomb was the pretext seized upon by all leaders as the reason for ending the war. But the aforementioned chain of events makes it almost a certainty the Japanese would have capitulated upon the entry of Russia into the war. In fact, this is admitted now in the official museum of the US Navy here in Washington, D.C., which has a display on the end of the war. And the official museum of the US Navy says, quote, the vast destruction wreaked by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the loss of 135,000 people made little impact on the Japanese military. However, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria changed their minds. So much more to say about this. Let me just say a little bit more. The United States has 8 five-star admirals and generals in 1945. 7 of the 8 are on record saying that the atomic bombings were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. Among those who were most outspoken in this regard was Admiral Leahy. Admiral Leahy compared the use of the atomic bomb. He says, now Leahy was Truman's personal chief of staff, and he chaired the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He says the Japanese were ready to surrender. The use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. And being the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. He later was asked by Truman biographer Jonathan Daniels. He said, and he told him, he says, Truman told me it was agreed that they would use it only to hit military objectives. Of course, then they went ahead and killed as many women and children as they could, which was just what they wanted all the time. Groves admitted that he had to go behind the backs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because of Leahy's disbelief in the weapon. General Eisenhower, got briefed at Potsdam by Stimson that the US was about to use the bomb. And Eisenhower said, this is the same General Eisenhower, later becomes president, warns against the military industrial complex because he built it. He knew what he was talking about. When Eisenhower became president, the United States had a little more than 1,000 atomic bombs. When Eisenhower left office, the US had over 22,000 atomic bombs. When Eisenhower's budgeting cycle was finished, the US had 30,000 atomic bombs. But Eisenhower was horrified that we used atomic bombs in World War II. And he says, so then Stimson told me they were going to drop it on the Japanese. Well, I listened, and I didn't volunteer anything because after all, my war was over in Europe and it wasn't up to me. But I was getting more and more depressed just thinking about it. Then he asked for my opinion. So I told him I was against it on 2 counts. First, the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Second, I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon. Eisenhower said he was sure that the US and Soviets would maintain friendly relations after the war until we dropped the atomic bomb. He said he was in Hiroshima when he got word. He was in Moscow when he got word of Hiroshima, and then he said all bets were off. Then he lost faith that there would be peace after the war. MacArthur, who wanted desperately to use atomic bombs in Korea. MacArthur wrote to former President Hoover. Hoover had written to Truman in May of 1945, a memo urging the US to change the surrender terms to end the war. He, like others, knew that the Japanese would not surrender unconditionally. MacArthur wrote to Hoover a couple times, but in 1960, he wrote an extraordinary letter to Hoover in which he applauded Hoover. He said it was a wise and statesmanlike document, and had it been put into effect, it would have obviated the slaughter at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in addition to much of the destruction of Japan. He said that the Japanese would have accepted it, and gladly, I have no doubt. MacArthur's basically saying that we could have ended the war months sooner if we had told the Japanese that they could keep the emperor. MacArthur always was horrified by the use of the bomb. As Richard Nixon told Time magazine in 1985, MacArthur thought it a tragedy that the bomb was ever exploded. We've got the same thing from General Hap Arnold, General Curtis LeMay, General Bonner Tellers, Admiral Ernest King, Admiral Chester Nimitz. As Nimitz says in September of 45, he at a press conference, he says, as the New York Times reports, the Admiral took the opportunity of adding his voice to those insisting that Japan had been defeated before the atomic bombings and Russia's entry into the war. Nimitz said at a speech at the Washington Monument in October 1945, The Japanese had in fact already sued for peace before the atomic age was announced to the world with the destruction of Hiroshima and before the Russian entry to the war. We have it from Bull Halsey. We have it from Jimmy Burns himself. Brigadier General Carter Clark, who was in charge of preparing the magic summaries, said, "We brought them down to an abject surrender through accelerated sinking of their merchant marine and hunger alone. And when we knew we didn't need to do it, and we knew they knew we didn't need to do it, we used them as an experiment for 2 atomic bombs." General Groves issued an order to the commanders in the field that they could not make any statements about the atomic bomb without clearing it first from Washington. He was later asked why he issued that order, and he said, "I didn't want MacArthur and the others going around saying the war could have been won without use of the atomic bombs." So where do we leave this? Truman always took responsibility. He always said, "The buck stops here. I'm responsible. I never lost a minute's sleep over that decision," he says. "I had no remorse about that decision." He said, "It was the easiest decision I ever made. I made it like that." But we know from the fact that Truman kept raising the estimate. First, he said thousands of American boys were saved because we didn't invade. Then he said tens of thousands. Then he said in his first draft of his memoir, 250,000. Then he says 1 million American boys were saved, 500,000, later 1 million. We have to assume that there was something else going on there that made him want to somehow justify this. But even Churchill knew this. Late in Truman's presidency, there was a dinner of top people, basically a farewell dinner for Truman. And in the middle of that, Churchill turns to Truman and says, "Mr. President, I hope you have your answer ready for that day when the 2 of us are standing before St. Peter." And he turns to us and says, "You two are the ones who set off those atomic bombs, aren't you? What do you have to say for yourselves?" Dead silence. His daughter said before that they were all in an ebullient mood. Now there was silence. Finally, Robert Levitt says to Churchill, "Are you sure you're going to be the same place that the president is when that moment comes?" So they let him off the hook. But Truman knew, they all knew, not only were the atomic bombs not necessary, what they did was exactly what the scientists on the Frank Committee in Chicago warned was going to happen. It started a nuclear arms race. The scientists issued a statement saying, even if we have the bomb, we shouldn't use it because it's going to trigger a nuclear arms race between us and the Soviets that's going to lead to our mutual annihilation. And that's exactly what happened. The Soviets interpreted, now the Soviets knew better than anybody how desperate the Japanese were to surrender. When the US dropped the atomic bomb, the Soviets interpreted it not that it was dropped against Japan, which was already defeated, but it was dropped against Moscow. They considered this the most ruthless possible warning. Truman and the Americans saying, "We are willing to wantonly kill hundreds of thousands of people to make a point that if you interfere with post-war US Japans in Europe or in the Pacific, this is what's going to happen to you, and worse, far, far worse." And because we knew how much worse it could get, Robert Oppenheimer briefed the members of the interim committee who were given the responsibility for making a decision about the bomb's use. On May 31st, Oppenheimer said that within 3 years, we're likely to have nuclear weapons between 700 and 7,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. They knew what was coming. The bomb that the Soviets tested in 1961, the Tsar Bomba, was 3,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. We have to get this into our minds. It's hard to imagine, but in 1954, there were secret scientific hearings at the US Congress in which leading American scientists testified about Project Sundial, which was a project that was seriously contemplated to build an atomic bomb that would be 700,000 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. 700,000 times. It is simply mind-boggling. I take my students every summer to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to study abroad class that I've been given since 1945. This was the first summer I couldn't do it. And every year I'd find myself writing down the same caption in the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima, that by 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.47 million Hiroshima bombs. Einstein warns in Civilization and Its Discontents in 1929 that human beings have a death instinct. I'm not sure that we do individually, but collectively as a species, we have to wonder if we do. We are piling up the means of our own destruction. And I'm not sure who to give the last word to. There are so many people who deserve it. But I think I will give it to Hanson Baldwin, who was the New York Times reporter and the military reporter for the New York Times. And Baldwin, if I can find this, which I probably can't now, basically said that this put on us the mark of the beast. Dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki put the mark of the beast on the United States. And the amazing thing is that we're still here to talk about it, because and we can get into more of this during the question period, but the reality is that human existence still hangs by a thread. And when the bullet atomic scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight, the world was actually a lot safer than it is today. And I fear what the hands of the doomsday clock are going to be when the Bulletin's Board of Editors decides to meet again beginning of next year. Anyway, thanks for listening. I know I've gone on a long time. Hopefully you've got some questions and we can clear up and I can develop some of these ideas a little further.
Thank you for that. That was a really great talk. We're moving on to questions and answers now. If you have a question, there's a little box at the bottom of the Zoom thing that says Q&A, and you can put your question in there and I will read them to Peter. We have several questions already. The first one is from Ben. There are two existential threats to humanity: climate change and nuclear war. There's a massive global movement against climate change, but people in this country who grew up after the Cold War are largely oblivious to the danger of nuclear war. How do we change that?
I spend every waking moment thinking about that. I've been mobilizing my colleagues. I did a series of events with Gar Alperovitz, Marty Sherwin, and Kai Bird. Marty and Kai wrote a great biography of Oppenheimer called American Prometheus, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Gar wrote the incredible book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. And we held a series of international press briefings, as well as a big public webinar, an international webinar on the decision to drop the bomb. We had an op-ed in the LA Times. Oliver Stone and I devoted all of episode 3 of Untold History to this question. Nuclear issues run throughout Untold History. If you haven't seen it, please watch it. It's easily available now on Netflix. You can purchase it from Amazon very inexpensively. You can pull it down illegally from YouTube. There's all kinds of ways to get it. But watch it. And when Oliver and I went all over the country to all the major campuses in the United States, the episode we would screen before our lecture was the episode about the atomic bomb. And I think we finally had some impact on this, because most of the public opinion surveys over the years show that 55% of Americans support the atomic bombings and 45% are opposed. But the last survey I saw in May of 2016, a CBS News report, showed that for the first time there was a plurality of people opposed. 44% opposed the atomic bombings, 43% supporting it. So the younger generation is much more skeptical, about the use of the atomic bomb. They're just not very knowledgeable about it. So my goal, what I did, since I wasn't able to go to Japan this summer, is I did scores of talks and interviews all over the world about this. And why we're doing this, why we're so passionate, is if you can justify use of the atomic bomb in 1945, then it gives some legitimacy to the atomic bomb now. But if you can show that from the beginning, it was a crime against, not only a crime against humanity, it's a crime to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people, but to threaten all of humanity with annihilation, to threaten to wipe out all future generations is beyond a war crime. And that's what has happened, and that's what we're doing still. What we have to do is use all our resources, and that's what I try to do in the courses I teach, in my Japan trips, which you're all invited to join us on. You don't have to be an AU student to do it. We bring lots of people who are not AU students. It's an amazing experience. We spend lots of time with atomic bomb survivors and do a lot of other things. We also studied Japanese atrocities during the war. There are a lot of other things I didn't get to tonight, like strategic bombing, like American racism toward the Japanese, like Japanese atrocities toward Americans, but especially toward other Asians. I mean, there's a lot, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's so crucial to understand this, because this is where so much of the nightmare that we're living with begins.
I would just say anecdotally, I do think the untold history of the United States you did with Oliver Stone has changed people's minds on the atomic bomb. This is a weird anecdote, but my dentist, I had the same dentist my whole life, he brought up to me unprompted that he had watched your series and he had always thought that, this was right when it came out, that he always thought that the atomic bomb had saved his father from dying in Japan, and that now he didn't think so anymore. And I've had the same dentist for 3 decades, so I know more about his opinions than the average person does about their dentist. But brought that up totally unprompted to me while cleaning my teeth. So there's the story for you.
The Democratic Socialists should know that it was Trotsky who accused the Socialist Party of being a party of dentists. But you know, having a father who's a dentist and a brother who's a dentist, I'm not in a position to pass judgment or see that negatively. So the dentists in my family also agree with your dentist that the atomic bomb was not necessary to end the war.
So we have a couple questions that I think are asking the same thing. David asked, are there internal documents that explain why the US decided to drop the bomb despite all evidence it wasn't necessary? And Thomas asked, why did Truman drop the bomb? You explained he didn't have to. What do you think the reason for him doing so is?
There are a lot of documents, and we got a lot of those documents out there. Yes, there are lots of documents. They don't explicitly say at the time that we're going to drop the bomb in order to warn the Soviets, but we have a lot of circumstantial evidence I don't have time to get to that I would be happy to share. First of all, Leslie Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project, who controlled the bomb and basically set the policy. Groves hated the Soviets. Groves said there was never, from about 2 weeks from the time I took charge of this project, any illusion on my part that Russia was our enemy and the project was conducted on that basis. That was Groves. Groves said to Joseph Rotblatt over dinner in March of 1944, he says, you realize, of course, that the main purpose of this project is to subdue the Russians. So Groves, who influenced this more than anybody except for Jimmy Burns, was very, very clear about that. Jimmy Burns was the one who had the greatest influence on Truman. And some of the scientists in May of 1945 went to see Truman at the White House to urge him not to use the bomb. And Truman sent them down to Spartanburg, South Carolina to see Jimmy Burns. And this was Leo Szilard, Walter Bartkey and Harold Urey on May 28th, 1945. And they implored Burns not to use the bomb. And then Burns turned to them and said, but says to Szilard, but you're Hungarian, aren't you? Don't you want to see us drive the Soviets out of Europe? Said the way we're going to do that is by using the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was clear that it was clear that that's what the bomb was about. We've got a lot more we can point to, but some examples. Marshal Zhukov, the top Soviet military leader in the war, later reflected about the Americans' real intention. He said, it was, quote, it was clear already that the US government intended to use the atomic weapon for the purpose of achieving its imperialist goals from a position of strength in the Cold War. This was amply corroborated on August 6th and 8th. Without any military need whatsoever, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on the peaceful and densely populated Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Gromyko's son, Anatoly, said that his father told him that Hiroshima, quote, set the heads of the Soviet military spinning. The mood in the Kremlin and the general staff was neurotic. The mistrust toward the Allies grew quickly. Opinions floated around to preserve a large land army, to establish controls over extended territories, to lessen potential losses from the atomic bombing. Foreign Minister Molotov and Stalin were also equally concerned. The physicist Yuli Khariton says the whole Soviet government interpreted Hiroshima as atomic blackmail against the USSR, as a threat to unleash a new, even more terrible and devastating war. We've got so much like this. So yeah, we know that the principal decision makers, including Truman, were obsessed with the Soviet Union during that time. As Margaret Truman, his daughter, said, my father was thinking constantly about the Soviet threat, because Truman takes office, the first day in office is April 13th. When Truman meets with Molotov on April 23rd, the whole American policy toward the Soviets had changed. The last memo that Roosevelt wrote to Churchill said that these issues between us and the Soviets pop up every day and they all work out, they all get resolved. We shouldn't make a big deal of them. Truman took the opposite stance, egged on by Burns, by Forrestal, by Stettinius. When he meets with Molotov on April 23rd, he starts berating Molotov for breaking all the Yalta agreements. Molotov says, I've never been talked to that way in my life. Truman says, carry out your agreements. You won't have to be talked to like that. He goes out in the hallway and brags, I gave it to him 1-2 to the jaw. So this is who Truman was. Then he becomes ambivalent for a while, but the relation between the US and the Soviets that could have been peaceful, that would have stayed friendly had Roosevelt lived longer or Wallace been president, were poisoned. And so it was clear, at least clear in my mind, that there was no military necessity. They all knew that, yet they wanted to use the bomb. And they did it deliberately to send a message to the Soviet Union.
So Anne wants to know, how long did it take Truman to make the final decision to use the bomb?
We don't really know. Truman was briefed on it on April 12th, April 13th, April 25th. There never seems to be good reason, or seems to be a basis for thinking that Truman had contemplated not using the bomb. We know Stimson, who referred to it as the awful, the terrible, the diabolical. We know Stimson had grave misgivings about it. We know that the military leaders did, or they didn't necessarily voice it to Truman at the time. We don't know that Truman ever seriously made a decision in that way. General Groves said his decision was one of non-interference. He went along with the program. Grove said Truman was like a little boy on a toboggan. He said they just dragged him along for the ride. So Truman would have had to stand up to them in a way that he probably was not psychologically capable of doing. And, that's the danger. Would Trump stand up to his advisors if they wanted to do something dangerous and crazy? Certainly not. At least probably not. And
Probably encourage them.
probably, yeah, egg them on. Truman, I don't know. Truman wasn't an evil man. He wasn't a bloodthirsty man. After the bombing of Nagasaki, he said he didn't want any more bombs to be dropped. He said, I don't want to kill all those children. But he did sign off on July 25th to the use of 2 atomic bombs. And the rest is history. We know what the consequences were. Did he make an explicit decision? There are some people who said there was no explicit decision, but he did authorize the use. And he knew what he was doing. And he had some understanding based on his own comments about what he was unleashing. So I don't think there's any way to exonerate Truman in this matter.
Sure. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and I'll read it. We have a question from Miles. Nuclear weapons have allowed those who possess them to use them as a hall pass to commit horrible violations of human rights. Think the US, China. How does the global community ensure human rights are preserved in countries possessing nuclear weapons?
Well, the global community has not figured that one out yet. Right now, there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. I don't think, would we really say any of them are democracies in the way we would like to see that? Is the United States a democracy in any truly meaningful sense? With elections that are bought and sold, with what we see happening now? I mean, we go into that. That would be an aside. North Korea, certainly there's no human rights there. Russia, China, United States, India under Modi, Pakistan, Israel, France, Britain. I mean, there's no way to really protect human rights. What the North Koreans said about the US invasion of Iraq was that Saddam Hussein made one grave mistake. If he had nuclear weapons, the United States would never have been able to invade. And that was the approach that they took. They, in 2006, tested their first atomic bomb. They've had 6 nuclear tests altogether, probably upwards of 60 nuclear weapons at this point. And that's really what saved them from being invaded. And they know that. The Iranians are vulnerable to an invasion, in part because they don't have nuclear weapons. I'm happy they don't have nuclear weapons. I'm certainly not encouraging them to have nuclear weapons. I think that nuclear abolition is the only thing that will safeguard us. Let me explain to you how dangerous this is. In the early 1980s, Carl Sagan and other leading physicists came up with the theory of nuclear winter. What we know now, based on the latest studies, is that their estimates are actually, for the threshold for nuclear winter, are actually low. The latest scientific studies show that a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, would burn the cities. The smoke, soot, and debris would go up into the stratosphere. Within 2 weeks, it would circle the globe. It would block the sun's rays from hitting the earth. The temperatures on the Earth's surface would plummet to freezing. Agriculture, much of the world would be destroyed, and up to 2 billion people would die. A limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. 2 countries that almost went to war last year, that bombed each other, and fortunately didn't go to a full-scale war. The reality is we don't have 100 nuclear weapons, we've got 14,000. They're not the size of Hiroshima. They're between 7 and 80 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. And so the world is threatened with this kind of existential threat that, as somebody mentioned before, the two major existential threats. And this is the immediate one. The long term, we've got to also worry about climate change, and we've got to turn that around immediately. And my students are sensitive to that. My students cared passionately about climate change. They care passionately about racial justice. They care about gender issues. And yet nuclear war is not on their radar for the most part, and hasn't been since the end of the Cold War. And we know from the studies of what things people worry about, that nuclear war is way down on the list. And that's delusional. I mean, that's really unforgivable right now.
So my colleague who runs the night school with me, David, has a question. He's asked, what was the reaction in the US to the dropping of the atomic bombs, aside from the military officials you mentioned?
We're number one. We're number one. USA, USA. The response, Gallup issued a poll right after the war, said that 85% of Americans supported the atomic bombings, believing that it ended the war and saved an invasion. The Roper issued a poll in 1945 that showed that 23% of Americans said they wished the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so we could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. In the southwestern United States, 30% said they wished we could have dropped more atomic bombs on the Japanese. But the response was more ambivalent. In fact, as several people commented, it's interesting that the first day, H.V. Kaltenborn, the NBC radio announcer who was quite famous at the time, said that we've unleashed a Frankenstein monster that someday will be used against us. American newspapers had diagrams of American cities of comparable size, like Dallas and Denver, and showing how much damage an atomic bomb would do if dropped on those cities. The Americans, that sense of jubilation that usually accompanies the end of the war, was missing. And many people commented and said that a sense of doom and gloom hangs over the United States because people are contemplating what a nuclear war would mean when the United States is the target of nuclear weapons in the future. So there was actually a much more nuanced kind of response than simply flag waving. But the Americans thought that the bomb ended the war and therefore did support it at the time.
So I'm going to put a last call for questions. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and we'll ask it. Otherwise, we're going to end with Mike, who has what's more of a, oh, we got more questions. Okay. Mike has more of a comment. He says the US has a history of using mass terror to fight wars that goes deeper than nuclear weapons, Dresden, Tokyo, etc. Yes, that's true. And then he also asked if he thought the black press came out against using the atomic bombs. I don't know if you have comments on either of those two things.
Well, if we had more time, I would talk about the firebombing campaign against Japan. As Secretary of War Stimson said to Truman in June of 1945, I don't want the United States to get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities. As McNamara was on LeMay's staff. McNamara said that LeMay told them that if we lose the war, we're all going to be tried as war criminals because of the bombing policy in Japan, and we deserve to be convicted. General Bonner Fellers said in a secret memo that the strategic bombing was one of the most ruthless annihilations of civilians in all of history. So yes, all war is brutal, but what the atomic bombs introduce now is the possibility of ending life on the planet. Up to that point, you could wipe out cities, but you couldn't really end life on the planet. Now we can, and now that's the real threat that we face. And I know there was another question there for Mike, but
He asked, was it true that the African-American press opposed the use of the atomic bombs?
Well, Langston Hughes and a lot of African-American leaders did. The African-American press was more ambivalent. If you want to study that, my former student, Vincent Intondi, wrote a very, very good book about the African-American response to the atomic bomb. And so you could get a hold of that. It's interesting how many of the most important Black leaders were in the forefront of the anti-nuclear movement, whether it's, and just spoke out strongly against it, whether it's Langston Hughes or W.B. Du Bois or Paul Robeson or Julian Bond or Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. I mean, you go down the line and almost all the Black leaders were very radicalized, became socialists at some point in their career, and Pan-Africanists, and also were outspokenly opposed to the American use of nuclear weapons in World War II, as well as afterwards. And because the thing we have to remember, and my friend Dan Ellsberg makes this point, he says that the United States didn't just use nuclear weapons twice. The United States has used nuclear weapons repeatedly, in the same sense that a person, a robber holding a gun to someone's head, uses that gun without pulling the trigger. So we've been living through this period of nuclear blackmail, which continues up to today. And it's continued certainly with the Trump administration, but Trump is not unique in that regard. It was Barack Obama, a fundamentally more decent human being, who not only spread the mythology about the bomb, but he also inaugurated a 30-year, $1 trillion modernization program of the entire nuclear arsenal and delivery systems to make nuclear weapons more efficient and more lethal. We know now that that's going to cost at least 1.7 trillion, probably more than that, and that every other country is following suit. And modernizing their nuclear arsenals. So the world is not getting less dangerous, it's sadly getting more dangerous. And just take a look right now about what's happening in the South China Sea and how that has just heated up over the past week on both sides. This escalation of tensions there and the danger of a confrontation there, which we don't know where that would stop, what that could lead to. And whether Trump, who doesn't want to look weak, whether Xi Jinping, who doesn't want to look weak, neither side willing to back down. I mean, it's just U.S. relations with Russia and China at the moment are at the absolute worst. Couldn't be very much worse. And it's a very dangerous world. But not just that, you've got China and India, you've got Israel, you got India and Pakistan. So many situations that could blow up.
So Ben has a question that I suspect is on a lot of people's minds. Would the US have dropped the bomb on Germany? Was there a racist aspect to dropping it on Japan?
Was there a racist aspect? Yes. The Americans hated the Japanese. Since you ask, I'm going to take a minute and find my notes on that, because there are a few quotes on this that are really worth people knowing. The Americans hated the Japanese. During World War II, the Americans clearly differentiated between the good Germans, who were the mass of the German people, and the Nazis, who were the leaders, who were evil. They had no such differentiation when it came to the Japanese. There was no such thing as a good Jap during the war. The American attitude, as Alan Nevins, the two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, wrote, he says, probably in all our history, no foe has been so detested as were the Japanese. Ernie Pyle, America's most popular war correspondent, shifted in February of 45 from Europe to the Pacific. And he said, in Europe, we felt that our enemies, horrible and deadly as they were still people. But out here, I soon gathered about the Japanese that they were looked upon as something subhuman and repulsive, the way some people feel about cockroaches or mice. Time magazine wrote, the ordinary, unreasoning Jap is ignorant. Perhaps he is human. Nothing indicates it. Newsweek reported, Never before has the nation fought a war in which our troops so hate the enemy and want to kill him. And I could go on and on. And there are reasons: the rape of Nanjing, the murder of nuns on the streets of Hong Kong, the Bataan Death March, the use of American prisoners for bayonet practice, the castration, burying, burning them alive, the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. There are a lot of reasons, but racism plays an important part, as we know from the internment of 120,000 Japanese civilians. And when it comes to Harry Truman, Truman himself was very, very racist. He wrote a letter in which he proposes to Bess as a younger man. And that letter, he says to her, "I think one man is as good as another so long as he's honest and decent and not a nigger or a Chinaman. Uncle Will says the Lord made a white man of dust, a nigger from mud, and then threw up what was left and it came down a Chinaman. He does hate Chinese and Japs, so do I. It's race prejudice, I guess." Truman, according to his friendly biographer, Merle Miller, he says, in private conversations, Truman never used any word to talk about blacks other than nigger. And Truman was a deeply bigoted man. Still, I think the United States would have used the bomb against Germany. It was originally designed as a deterrent against a German bomb. In 1943, they decided the target would be Japan. But I think that there was deep enough hatred, especially among the scientists, toward Germany, that it might not have been quite as cavalier a decision. And the United States was rife with racism. I could go on and on about this, but I think that they probably would have also used it against Japan, but they would have given it much more sober thought and consideration. And certainly the bombing policy toward Germany was different than the bombing policy toward Japan.
So I'm going to end with this question. What can we as socialists do to be part of a global movement to bolster the movement nuclear weapons?
I think that the democratic socialists need to just put this at the top of the agenda. I mean, we're socialists because we believe in humanity. We're socialists because of our vision of what a good world could look like. We're socialists because we think it's insane to live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. We're socialists because we think it's insane to live in a country in which the richest 3 people have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. We're socialists because we hate racism, we hate injustice, we hate exploitation, we hate oppression, and we hate a country in which people are motivated by greed instead of some vision of human brotherhood. And so for all of those reasons, we have to deplore nuclear weapons and what they would do and what they threaten to do, because maybe we can't create a socialist society within my lifetime. Hopefully we can within your lifetime. But even if it's not within your lifetime, maybe 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now, humanity will advance to the point where we can create a sane and just and decent society. But our mission, our responsibility is to bridge the gap between now, when we've got the mindset of primitives, of barbarians, but the technology of gods, of superpowers who can wipe out existence on the planet before human beings have a chance to actually realize that potential. So I think that that's the socialist vision, the socialist message, and the one that we should all carry forward.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a really important talk. I'm glad we could bring you here to have it. If you liked this talk, our next Socialist Night School is going to be on Wednesday, September 9th at 6:30 p.m. It's going to be on the Alabama Communist Party from the years 1930 to 1950. We're going to be joined by Mary Stanton. Mary wrote the book Red, Black, White, the Alabama Communist Party 1930 to 1950. There's very good write-ups on the book in both The Nation and Jacobin. We're really excited to have her. And we're also excited because this night school is going to be co-sponsored with North Alabama DSA, because they saw on our Twitter we were doing this and we invited them to co-sponsor it. That's one of the upsides of everything being virtual. We get to have people who aren't in the same geographic location co-sponsor and work with us. I do miss seeing you all, but if we were still meeting in person, we would not be co-sponsoring with North Alabama DSA. David, do you want to tell people how to get involved in DSA?
Sure. So if you would like to become a Metro DC DSA member and to learn more about how you can get plugged in, you can check it out at the new members link, which I'm dropping into the chat right here. And then also, if you'd like to contact us here at the Night School team, you can email us at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. You can find us on Twitter at @nightschool_DC. And if you're in the chapter, you can find us on Slack at political-education. I'm going to put the email and the Twitter handle into the chat as well. You can find some past events on our YouTube page, which is right here, including this one, if you'd like to share that with your friends and such. And then lastly, you can check out the Night School website, which has past events as well as resources like additional reading and things like that, which you can check out in the future. So that's it. And Chip, back to you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I think that's everything, right, David?
I think so.
On that note, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. It was, oh, Peter's gone. It was a pleasure to have him, and thank you, everyone who attended.